The forest was quiet the morning search teams began their sweep. The kind of quiet that feels staged by the world itself, as if nature were holding its breath. Nothing moved except the slow tremble of frost on the branches. In the stillness, a name began to surface in hushed conversations among investigators. An unfamiliar drifter whose shadow had passed through these woodlands again and again. No one knew it yet, but the man they were looking for had spent years blending into the vast American wilderness. Moving like a figure you only notice once he's already gone. His presence was subtle, his habits unremarkable, his life almost invisible. And yet, he was about to become the center of an infamous case that would grip the public, reshape how hikers saw the outdoors, and mark one of the most unsettling chapters in psychological true crime history. Long before his name surfaced on police radios, a young woman named Meredith Emerson laced up her hiking boots for what she believed would be another ordinary day in the Georgia mountains. She was strong, spirited, disciplined, someone who found clarity and movement in the rhythm of her breath, in the open space of a trail unfolding beneath her feet. Her friends described her as magnetic without trying to be. A person who made others feel steadier simply by standing near them. Her world was built on care and curiosity, not on fear. Even as she stepped into the forest that morning, she had every reason to believe the world was still a safe place. But parallel to her path, drifting at a distance that would have seemed harmless to anyone passing by, moved a man whose life had been unraveling for years. Gary Michael Hilton had become a permanent wanderer, a figure with just enough charm to disarm, just enough instability to unsettle, and a growing sense that he no longer belonged anywhere people lived ordinary lives. He existed between campsites, road shoulders, forgotten lots, and long stretches of forest. Nomadic wasn't a lifestyle for him. It was a symptom. He drifted because remaining still meant confronting a mind that no longer held its shape. In the decades before that morning, he had slowly separated himself from the world. Once a child with promise, he had grown into a man carrying decades of fractures. Cognitive instability, feelings of powerlessness, a fear of abandonment, and an emerging belief that the universe had turned colder than he could endure. Friends saw glimpses of volatility. Employers saw a man who couldn't hold structure. Strange outbursts punctuated otherwise normal days. His sense of identity flickered on and off, as if he were watching himself from a distance. And worst of all, no one intervened when the unraveling became undeniable. His life had drifted into a dangerous pattern, temporary stability, followed by emotional collapse, then movement, always movement, into the woods, where he felt both invisible and in control. The isolation fed his resentment. The resentment fed his fantasies of self-importance. Over time, the woods became the one place where he believed the world couldn't push him aside anymore. As Meredith walked deeper into the trail, Hilton watched from the periphery, guided by impulses he no longer recognized as dangerous. What he saw in her wasn't a person, not fully. He saw confidence, direction, purpose, all the things he had lost and couldn't get back. His thoughts began to twist into a narrative where he believed he somehow deserved what others had, even if he had to take it. When he stepped onto the trail behind her, it wasn't a decision made in an instant. It was the consequence of years of psychological erosion, years of drifting between moments of clarity, and long stretches where he no longer felt tethered to anything. That day would become the moment where two lives intersected. One shaped by ambition, the other by disintegration. And as investigators would later learn, this encounter was not spontaneous. It was part of a developing pattern. One Hilton had rehearsed in quiet corners of the mountains. Long before anyone realized danger was growing in the shadows. In the days that followed, the search for Meredith grew into a public movement, a reflection of how deeply she was loved, and how profoundly people sensed that something was wrong. Volunteers formed lines across rough terrain, calling her name into canyons and ravines. Helicopters cut across the sky. Social media posts turned her smiling photos into national symbols of urgency. Her world, filled with friends, family, routines, and dreams, became the center of an unfolding investigation. That drew the attention of millions. And somewhere beyond the edges of those search grids, Hilton continued drifting, watching the world react to something he had tried to hide. For the first time in years, the forest no longer felt like protection. And investigators, slowly piecing together clues, began to realize the man they were seeking was not a simple figure who snapped in a moment. He was the product of a long, complicated descent, one that had left many warning signs ignored. This case was no longer just about a missing woman. It was becoming a window into the psychology of a man who spent years slipping through society unnoticed, carrying a storm that no one had managed to name. The investigation was tightening. Hilton was running out of places to disappear, and the truth about what happened in those woods was about to shift, from speculation to inevitability, as law enforcement began to understand the kind of man they were truly dealing with. The days following Meredith Emerson's disappearance formed a tightening spiral, drawing investigators into a landscape that offered beauty by day and dread by night. The Georgia mountains had always been a sanctuary for hikers, a place where the world slowed to a pace that reminded people of their own smallness. But now, every quiet grove and shaded bend in the trail carried the weight of what might have happened out of sight. Search teams moved with a new intensity, sensing that the forest held a secret just beyond reach. Even before any definitive clue emerged, detectives felt they were pursuing someone who understood these woods better than they did. Someone who moved through them with an ease learned over years of solitude. As search operations expanded, a series of seemingly minor sightings began to surface. Hikers recalled a wiry, weathered man with a distant expression. Park employees remembered someone who lingered around trailheads without a clear purpose. A store clerk mentioned a customer who seemed anxious, as if he were both present and elsewhere at the same time. None of these encounters felt alarming on their own, but taken together they painted the blurry outline of a transient figure who drifted between campsites and forest access roads. A man without attachments. A man who didn't quite fit. That figure was Hilton. And in the days after the encounter with Meredith, he moved in patterns that revealed a mind slipping deeper into self-made narratives. He alternated between restless pacing and long, vacant stares. His thoughts churned with the tension of someone who believed he had crossed a point of no return, yet also held a fragile hope that he could outmaneuver the world for a little longer. The internal fractures noted in psychological evaluations, the identity confusion, the paranoid ideation, the fixation on perceived injustices, were now steering his actions. He wandered through gas stations, wooded pull-offs, and isolated parking lots, trying to decide whether to run, hide, or simply wait for the inevitable. Meanwhile, investigators were assembling a puzzle, without knowing the full picture. Evidence suggested a confrontation on the trail, a sudden moment when the day shifted from routine to irrevocable. Witness reports helped establish a timeline indicating the encounter may have escalated quickly into a struggle for control. The terminology remained careful, grounded in respect for the victim, and mindful of the limits of what the public needed to know. What the world learned was that Meredith had faced a terrifying situation with remarkable courage, resisting in ways that stunned even seasoned detectives. Her determination created delays, interruptions, moments of hesitation, moments that mattered. But the encounter ultimately spiraled into a fatal outcome, marking a point where Hilton's long-suppressed instability took command. Investigators would later describe this moment as a violent episode in the shadows, a phrase meant to capture the seriousness of the act, while honoring Meredith's strength and protecting her dignity. The specifics remained guarded, but what is clear is that her final hours revealed both her resilience and the depth of Hilton's psychological deterioration. In the immediate aftermath, Hilton struggled to maintain coherence. His behavior shifted between hurried movements and eerie calm. He returned to his van, rearranging items in a way that suggested panic battling with delusion. He attempted to distance himself from the scene, driving through back roads and small towns, convinced he could detach from what had unfolded. But the world he had worked so hard to avoid, filled with rules, routines, and consequences, was about to find him. Within days, detectives recovered key items belonging to Meredith, abandoned in a way that revealed both haste and fear. Each object became a thread leading them closer to the truth. A TM footage provided grainy glimpses of a man whose face carried exhaustion and a frantic kind of determination. Surveillance images from roadside businesses added more detail. The shadowy figure described by hikers now had a clearer shape, and soon a name. As the investigation advanced, a chilling realization emerged: this wasn't an isolated event. Clues began to suggest that Hilton had crossed paths with others in different regions. People whose peaceful days in nature had ended suddenly, inexplicably. Investigators in Georgia began exchanging information with authorities in Florida and North Carolina, discovering parallels that formed an unsettling pattern. The possibility that Hilton had been drifting between states, connected to disappearances in remote areas, cast the case in a broader, more haunting light. Still, in these early days after Meredith's encounter, the focus remained deeply personal. Friends and family held on to hope, replaying memories that felt too vivid to accept as final. Her face appeared on news broadcasts across the country, turning the case into a national story. That fused grief with urgency. The public followed every update, drawn to the mystery of how an ordinary hike could spiral into a tragedy that defied comprehension. For investigators, the stakes were rising. Every hour mattered. Every tip, no matter how small, held potential. And as they closed in on the man they believed responsible, Hilton moved with increasing unpredictability, acting as though he sensed the net tightening, but couldn't decide how or whether to slip through it. This was no longer simply a missing person case. It was becoming the unraveling of a drifter, whose life had been collapsing in slow motion, leaving devastation in his wake. And the next stage of the investigation would reveal just how much of that devastation had remained hidden until now. The investigation shifted gears the moment law enforcement connected the scattered clues into something sharper than coincidence. What began as a regional search effort was now transforming into a multi-state pursuit, drawing in detectives from Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina. Each state had its own story, its own missing person case, its own riddle buried in the woods. And strangely, each riddle began to echo the others. Georgia investigators were the first to notice the unusual consistency in witness descriptions. A lean, gray-haired drifter, a dog that never left his side, a van patched with stickers and dents moving from trailhead to trailhead, like a ghostly caravan. These sightings, once dismissed as random encounters with an eccentric outdoorsman, began to look like the movements of someone searching for opportunity, someone who navigated rural environments with practiced ease, someone who felt more at home among trees and back roads than in any town or city. Meanwhile, forensic analysts worked through the hours, sorting through the items recovered from abandoned locations connected to Meredith. Small objects can tell the truth long before a suspect does, and these did. Each item carried traces of routine, her normal life, her identity, suddenly uprooted. But one discovery stood out, something investigators instantly recognized as a turning point. Clear indications that Meredith had resisted. Witness accounts had hinted at it. Physical evidence confirmed it. Her strength had delayed Hilton, disrupted his plans, bought crucial hours. That would become the heartbeat of the investigation. With the public now fully aware of the case, the media coverage grew intense, turning the search for Meredith and the pursuit of the unknown drifter into a nationwide event. News anchors spoke of an escalating mystery, a phrase that captured the tension, without revealing the darkest details. Viewers across the country followed each development, driven by compassion for Meredith, and alarm at the idea that the serene world of hiking trails could hide unpredictable dangers. Communities in Georgia turned their attention to every update from law enforcement. Rumors spread quickly. Speculation multiplied, but detectives stayed grounded, knowing one wrong assumption could derail everything. The atmosphere inside the investigative headquarters was both electric and heavy, the kind of atmosphere that emerges when detectives sense the truth closing in. But no, they're not quite there yet. Evidence teams studied gas station receipts and security camera timestamps, cross-checking them with cell tower pings and vehicle sightings. A blurry photograph of Hilton's van surfaced from a tipster, showing it parked near a popular trailhead. Days before the encounter with Meredith, that image became a linchpin, connecting him to the area with more precision than any eyewitness account could. And once detectives had a vehicle, they could chase patterns of travel. As they dug deeper, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation discovered something alarming. Hilton's name was already in databases, but never at the center of anything serious. Past reports described him as erratic, unstable, combative at times, but always slipping through the cracks. His behavior had raised concerns, but not enough to prompt intervention. A former employer recalled seeing sudden shifts in his mood, from calm to explosive. Acquaintances described him as someone who struggled with identity, who seemed to forget himself, and then overcompensate with self-invented importance. Mental health professionals who had evaluated him in earlier years noted patterns of paranoia and a tenuous grasp on reality. None of it had coalesced into a case file strong enough to predict what was coming. detectives began to ask new questions. How had this man lived undetected in the southeastern wilderness for so long? How many times had he wandered trails unnoticed, blending in with hikers who assumed he was simply another nature enthusiast? How many warning signs had gone unrecognized because they looked like eccentricities, instead of indicators of a deeper psychological conflict? The closer investigators looked, the more they realized this wasn't a sudden explosion of violence. It was an escalation. Slow, steady, and shaped by years of emotional deterioration. And Meredith wasn't the only person who had crossed paths with him. In Florida, authorities remembered the unsolved disappearance of Cheryl Dunlap, a case that had baffled detectives. In North Carolina, the deaths of John and Irene Bryant, a couple known for their adventurous spirit, had left a haunting gap in a tight-knit community. At the time, none of these cases seemed linked, but now the parallels were impossible to ignore. Each victim had been last seen in or near the woods. Each case involved a sudden disappearance, with signs of a confrontation. And in each case, witnesses mentioned a man who seemed just a little out of place, lurking near trailheads, with no clear purpose. This was the moment everything shifted. Georgia authorities contacted the FBI, regional law enforcement in Florida and North Carolina, renewed their examinations of old evidence. The investigation began to unfold like a tapestry, with threads stretching across state lines and converging into a single disturbing pattern. Hilton was no longer a suspicious drifter. He was a potential link between multiple disappearances across the Southeast, a possibility that sharpened the urgency of the hunt. As pressure mounted, Hilton's behavior grew more erratic. Surveillance footage captured him pacing around convenience stores, talking to himself or staring blankly at the shelves, as if he couldn't remember why he entered. His van was seen at odd hours on remote roads, headlights cutting through empty landscapes. He seemed to be circling, not escaping. A man trapped in his own unraveling. And then, a breakthrough. Investigators discovered a trail of financial activity tied to Meredith's bank card. The transactions were small, cautious, spaced out, reflecting a man who understood, at least dimly, that authorities were watching. But he underestimated the speed and scope of the search. Every ATM he approached became another breadcrumb, leading detectives straight to him. The walls were closing in. The public was watching. Multiple states were now aligned. And Hilton, long accustomed to drifting without consequence, was about to learn that the wilderness could no longer shield him from the world he had spent a lifetime avoiding. The final steps toward Hilton's arrest unfolded with a mix of meticulous planning and sheer inevitability. Once investigators triangulated the ATM withdrawals, they created a predictive map of his possible movements. He was staying close to wooded areas, hugging the edges of small towns, as if proximity to the forest gave him a sense of protection. Detectives knew that someone who lived largely outdoors would feel most at ease returning to long familiar haunts, so they focused on trailheads, rest stops, and back roads branching off the Appalachian foothills. Each hour brought new reports. Each report brought the sense that the window to catch him was narrowing. Then the moment came. A sharp-eyed officer spotted a van matching the description, idling in a parking lot near a convenience store in DeKalb County. The vehicle looked weary. An aging shell patched with makeshift repairs, its interior cluttered with gear from a life spent drifting. Hilton was nearby, his dog close to him, his gaze unfocused. As if he were caught between action and surrender, the officer approached with caution, moving with the knowledge that this was a man whose behavior had repeatedly shown volatility and unpredictability. When backup arrived, the officers surrounded him in a quiet but coordinated sweep, leaving no room for escape. Hilton didn't run. His shoulders sagged, as if the weight he'd been carrying finally collapsed inward. Detectives later said it looked like he'd been expecting this moment, living in anticipation of it, perhaps even relieved by it. He was taken into custody peacefully, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. This wasn't closure. It was the beginning of a deeper, more painful truth. Inside the interrogation room, Hilton oscillated between clarity and confusion. He made statements that seemed grounded in reality, only to drift moments later into contradictions, self-pity, or accusations against invisible adversaries. His mind, long shaped by psychological instability and fractured identity, moved like a flickering signal, sometimes coherent, sometimes lost in static. Investigators who interviewed him described the conversations as unsettling. They could sense intelligence beneath the disarray. A man capable of understanding what he had done, yet shielded by layers of delusion, resentment, and self-created mythology. As the questioning progressed, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Hilton acknowledged encounters with multiple victims, including Meredith, Cheryl Dunlap, and the Bryants, but the details he offered drifted between admission and deflection. Detectives relied heavily on physical evidence, travel records, and forensic analysis to confirm his timeline. His words alone could not be trusted. They floated somewhere between confession and fantasy, but one truth became unmistakable. Hilton's actions were not impulsive explosions. They were the result of a long, slow descent. A collapse shaped by years of untreated mental health disorders, social alienation, and the absence of meaningful connections. Psychological evaluations painted a portrait of a man who struggled with identity confusion, paranoia, and acute distrust. He saw himself as a wanderer wronged by society, someone who believed he was owed something intangible and was determined to reclaim it through control over others. It was a worldview warped by isolation, fueled by the belief that he could exist outside all social norms. His internal distortions were powerful enough to override empathy, leaving him tethered only to his own fears and impulses. The deeper investigators dug into his past, the more troubling details they found. Hilton had drifted through jobs, relationships, and regions without stability. He sometimes worked for outdoor-related companies, but never lasted long. Employers described mood swings, sudden outbursts, and a persistent sense that he lived in a world separate from everyone else. Friends, or the closest approximation of friends he ever had, recalled moments when he seemed lost inside himself, as though he were watching life, rather than participating in it. His transient lifestyles, at first glance romantic or adventurous, had in fact become a hiding place for a deteriorating psyche. Mental health specialists emphasized that Hilton's acts stemmed not only from personal instability, but also from systemic failures. There had been moments earlier in his life when intervention might have changed his trajectory, periods when his paranoia was noticeable, when he expressed violent fantasies, when he drifted aimlessly with visible distress. But because he avoided deep connections and moved constantly, no one agency or person took full responsibility for tracking his decline. He simply slipped through every gap. In retrospect, Hilton's behavior contained warning signs, amplified by his solitary existence. He lived without community, without consistent support, without the grounding influence of stable relationships. The forest became both his refuge and his distortion field, a place where he felt powerful, because no one could challenge him. He saw hikers not as neighbors on the trail, but as symbols of a society he felt alienated from, and in his most fractured moments, he reacted to that alienation in catastrophic ways. The emotional weight of these revelations was immense. Families of the victims attended briefings, listening with quiet resolve, as investigators explained what had been reconstructed. They heard about timelines, locations, and circumstances, but nothing could fill the void left behind. What mattered most was the person they lost, their joy, their promise, their light. For them, the case wasn't an infamous moment in true crime history. It was a wound that reshaped their future. Public reaction, too, grew solemn and reflective. People who followed the story felt the gravity of what had been uncovered. Online discussions centered not only on the investigation, but also on broader questions. How do we recognize people in crisis? How do we protect vulnerable individuals without isolating them further? And how do we create safer spaces in nature while avoiding fear that overshadows the beauty of the outdoors? As the interrogation phase came to a close, Hilton's fate shifted from the hands of investigators to those of prosecutors. The legal process would be long, but the emotional truth had already crystallized. The man responsible was no longer a mysterious figure in the woods. He was someone whose internal chaos had collided with innocent lives, leaving entire communities changed forever. And the courtroom would soon determine what the world would do with that truth. When the legal proceedings began, the courtroom felt like an intersection of grief, truth, and long-awaited accountability. Gary Michael Hilton was no longer the spectral drifter described in early news bulletins, or the mysterious figure caught on grainy convenience store cameras. He was a man seated beneath unflinching lights, facing the weight of the lives forever altered by his actions. The families of Meredith Emerson, Cheryl Dunlap, John and Irene Bryant, and others sat with a quiet strength that filled the room far more powerfully than anger ever could. Their presence reminded everyone that this case was not about fascination or fear. It was about loss, resilience, and the right to know what happened to the people they loved. Prosecutors presented a timeline grounded in evidence rather than speculation. They drew on forensic data, financial records, witness testimony, and Hilton's own fragmented statements. The picture they painted was careful and respectful, avoiding sensationalism in favor of clarity. Jurors listened as experts explained how the investigation unfolded, how multiple states coordinated, and how the truth emerged piece by piece, until the pattern became impossible to ignore. Each explanation carried the emotional gravity of lives interrupted and families left searching for answers. Hilton's defense team attempted to contextualize his deteriorating mental health, pointing to decades of instability and untreated psychological issues. But mental health professionals noted that while his grasp on reality fluctuated, he possessed a consistent awareness of his actions and their consequences. The court recognized the complexity of his psychological state, but it also recognized the severity of what had occurred. Ultimately, Hilton was held responsible for the choices he made during the critical moments. That shaped this case. The sentencing brought with it a solemn finality. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. Only a collective exhale, a quiet acknowledgement that justice, while necessary, could never restore what had been lost. Hilton received the maximum penalties allowed under law, ensuring he would spend the remainder of his life separated from the society he had repeatedly harmed. The families spoke with grace and clarity, honoring the memories of their loved ones and reminding the court of the beautiful, hopeful lives each victim had lived. Their words carried a power that reached far beyond the courtroom, offering a way forward, rooted not in vengeance, but in remembrance. When the hearings concluded, the public conversation shifted to reflection. This case had become more than an investigation. It had become a lens through which people examined the complexities of mental health, the vulnerabilities in outdoor recreation, and the systems designed to protect communities. Many wondered how someone like Hilton had managed to drift across state lines, slipping through institutional cracks for years, without intervention. Advocates called for stronger mental health support, better coordination between agencies, and renewed investment in public safety programs. For wilderness areas, hikers and park officials spoke about balancing freedom with awareness, ensuring that the outdoors remained accessible, while encouraging people to stay informed and prepared. For those closest to the victims, the journey continued privately. Healing does not follow a courtroom schedule. It moves quietly, through memories, through shared stories, through the love that endures long after tragedy. Families established foundations, organized memorial hikes, and supported initiatives to keep public trails safer. Their resilience became a testament, not only to their strength, but also to the character of the people they lost. Meredith's spirit of optimism, Cheryl's devotion to her community, and the Bryant's lifelong passion for the natural world became guiding lights for conversations about awareness and prevention. As the story settled into public consciousness, it became one of those unsettling chapters in true crime history that people revisit not for shock, but for insight. It served as a reminder that even the most peaceful spaces can hold hidden dangers, and that community vigilance can save lives. It also highlighted how easily individuals struggling with psychological decline can vanish into the margins unseen until they resurface in devastating ways. Understanding these complexities is essential to preventing similar tragedies and supporting those who feel themselves slipping into isolation. Sometimes the most important lessons emerge after the story ends. This case continues to influence conversations about public safety, mental health, and community vigilance. It encourages people to look out for one another, to speak up when something feels wrong, and to stay mindful in places where solitude meets vulnerability. When we carry these lessons forward, we honor the lives lost far more meaningfully than any headline ever could. If this documentary offered clarity or helped deepen your understanding of this infamous case, joining this channel's community helps keep these conversations alive. Thoughtful engagement strengthens awareness, preserves memories, and supports future work. That approaches psychological true crime with care, respect, and depth. Together, we continue learning from the past, not to dwell in fear, but to build safer, more informed spaces for everyone.